Well, hope you have tuned in now and are staying safe at home and healthy. And so today we're going to give you a chance to see what we're doing here with fish and wildlife and some of the conservation we work with some of the absolute rarest animals that we have on the planet. So I'm talking about freshwater mussels. And freshwater mussels, they are these things that we find living in streams, and a lot of people will relate to these when they're out on the beach or something, but these are freshwater, not marine. So we're going to talk about these and why they're different than the ones you find in the ocean. So freshwater mussels, I'm going to go over the life cycle a little bit so you can understand a little bit about why we do what we do here at the Fish and Wildlife. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the life cycle of a freshwater mussel. Now you can see from this slide that we have the mussel, and then going to our left you'll see a little mussel that has these little red like worms, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But freshwater mussels live in the bottom of the streams and rivers, and they reproduce sexually, and the male releases its gametes into the water, and the female will need to collect those and produce a fertilized egg, which will turn into a little larvae. So just imagine like a butterfly. You have a butterfly and they lay an egg on a leaf, and the egg will hatch and turn into a caterpillar, and then later back into the butterfly. Mussels do something similar. So they have a larval stage similar to the caterpillar stage called a glaucidia, and basically that little stage is microscopic, and it has to come in contact with a host fish. So that little tiny thing that's smaller than a grain of salt, that little tiny glaucidia or larvae is very small, and it has to come in contact with a host fish, and not any of them will work. So we have over 100 species of mussels in Kentucky, over 200 something species of fish, and so just think of all the possible combinations. So once they get on the fish host, then what will happen is they will live their life on there for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then they'll go through the little cocoon stage and then drop off into the bottom, start their life. Now mussels are filter feeders. Here's one that's out in the river. You can see it's filtering the water with these little siphon tubes, and here's what they look like on the bottom. Here's actually me pulling one out of the bottom. It's dug down into the substrate. Sometimes they look like rocks. And then here's another one with filtering. They're very camouflaged because all the algae that lives on them kind of helps them hide from the predators like raccoons and muskrats, things like that. Here's what a juvenile looks like. Now freshwater mussels filter the water, and here's a little experiment I did where I put muddy water on one side and they filtered it just in no time. Mussels live in a lot of different places, from small to medium-sized rivers like the Licking and the Green, and they can live in large numbers sometimes, and a lot of variety usually in one place. So here's one that's got a lure. I showed you this earlier and explained this worm. A worm lure, basically the mussel will wiggle this and trying to attract its host fish. This fish will come along and they will strike at this worm, like this example here. Here's one that the little bluegill is, along here sunfish, is striking the lure and getting a mouthful of larvae. Here's another angle of that, a different kind of lure, but now it's connecting with this host fish. Other fish lures that are out there the mussels have, they even look like a fish. The eye spots, they're even curved and shaped like a fish with fins, and so on. And here's the worm-like lure. So as soon as you touch that mussel, the worm was released, and then several thousand larvae are on the edge of this, and the fish will eat that and get connected. Here's a piece of salt up the top left, and here's the larvae. They're tiny, smaller than a piece of salt, and so these little tiny larvae have to get onto the fish. Here at the center, we actually do it artificially. We'll put the fish to sleep and actually put them on there, so that way we know for sure that they get on to the animals. Here's an example of some of the host fish. You'll actually get to see some fish today that we have here. These are some minnows. They're good hosts for a lot of things, and then darters like this log perch. And there's a lot of really cool looking fish here in the state. We have a lot of darter species. They live on the bottom, and they act as a very, very good host. So now that I've talked to you a little bit about the life cycle of mussel, I'm going to talk about what we do here at the center. So one of the things that we do is we have to keep up with all the different species. We have over 100 species in the state, and there's a lot of interesting names. Now I'm not going to go over the Latin names, But there's some cool names like the washboard. A lot of people are familiar with this mussel. It gets very big, bigger than my hand. This was actually a small one. They get twice as big as this almost. There's some animals that some people are familiar with called the heel splitter. And the reason they're called that is because they're down in the water like this and they have this sharp little heel, and if you step on them with no shoes on, it's going to hurt pretty good. Now this one's called the pink heel splitter because you see it's got pinkish purple color on the inside. There's also one called the white heel splitter that I'll hold up next to it. And it's very similar looking, but it's white on the inside. So there's a lot of other ones that have lots of interesting names. Here's one of my favorites. This is the rabbit's foot, and it looks like an old-fashioned rabbit's foot that we used to wear when we were kids. There's a pimpleback. Here's a spike, and this spike is also purple on the inside, and some of these mussels have really brilliant colors, from orange to white to purple to pink, and all kinds in between. Some mussels, even within the species, they may look different. Like here's one, this is a male and this one's a female, and they're shaped quite different. And this is sometimes as biologists we're able to look at them and know that if we need to find a female out in the wild, we're only looking for this shape versus this one. So now we're going to go in and we also, before we go in the lab, I want to just tell you we do keep a collection of mussels. We keep them organized in these little trays so we can keep up with all the different species that we have in the state. Again, we have over 100 species, and one of the problems is we have over 27 federally listed as endangered or threatened. So that's a problem because we have about 30% of our mussels are in need of some kind of protection or assistance from the agency and from you as well. And so we're going to talk about what we're doing about that. So 27 endangered mussels here in the state, that's a lot. And most people didn't even know that we had that many species that are endangered in the state of Kentucky when we have so many in one species group. So we're going to go into the lab. We're going to talk about how we raise our algae for the feed the mussels that we have here. We're going to talk about water quality. We always are checking that. And you're going to see some cool technology. And the first technology we've got is for algae is right behind us. This is called an industrial plankton bioreactor. Now it's empty right now because we just shut it down yesterday after a harvest, and we'll start it back up later. But this is a fairly expensive machine, allows us to control all the different parameters. It's computerized and controlled. It self-feeds itself just with some push of a button, and it's really high technology. And we got one of the very first ones in the country a few years ago, and we're allowed to use this to be able to enhance our ability to raise freshwater algae. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the lab. So here we have our lab, and on our left is our water quality side. So we actually have a spectrophotometer, which is a high-tech machine that allows us to measure all kinds of water quality parameters. We have pH meters, probes, and all this stuff, but these little tiny machines allow us to detect all kinds of different problems and good things that are in the water. This is a particle counter, allows us to count algae cells. It's pretty important, so we need to know how much food that the mussels are getting, so this allows us to do that. So when you think about this lab, you think of it a little bit like a normal lab you would have at a university, like a chemistry lab. But we also have some high-tech equipment, such as these microscopes that are connected to our computers. And this allows us to basically look at things that are really small, like the grain of a salt, under a microscope. And I'll show you an example of a couple of these. So here's an example of some juvenile mussels that we took a picture of under the microscope. You can see their foot, and they're crawling around, and this is a good sign we want to see. These are less than a few hours old, not just a few minutes old, so it's cool to be able to see that. Now out in the field, we wouldn't see juveniles that small. We would see more things that are much larger, and sometimes we would even see things that look like this, a red-looking lure. So this is one that the mussel is trying to attract a host fish. In this case, it's a bass. So if you're a bass fisherman, you may want to try some red lures in the springtime in May, because this is when this mussel would be going fishing as well. And there's some other cool-looking lures that we might have as well. This is one of my favorite lures. This is the cat's paw. It has these teeth, and it'll actually grab a hold of the fish and hold on to it for a few minutes. And the lure is this little thing here, and it's going to move back and forth, and looks like some kind of insect or something. but this is not a critter. This is actually a lure the mussel has to attract its host fish, and it's a really neat, this is called the cat's paw, really, really rare animal that we've done some pretty well with raising them here and releasing in the wild. But this was thought to be extinct in the 90s, and now we're bringing this animal back because we can actually raise them in captivity. So we also have some other equipment in here that you would normally have at a lab. We've got scales, we've got balances, we've got ultra pure water systems, and all kinds of cool stuff. We raise our algae in incubators. So here's an example of how we start that. We start them in these tubes under a microscope, under a hood, and I'll show you a hood in a second. And this is where we keep base cultures going. Once they come out of here, they go to the next stage, which is a little larger size containers. So you can see here we have about 3 different kinds of algae. This is a brown algae that's in a darker phase than this one. This one was just started today, and this one is about 4 or 5 days old. Up on top, we've got 2 different species of green algae. So a lot of stuff you see when you're driving around and you see a pond that's green, this is the stuff that makes it green, but these are actually pure cultures. There's only 1 species in it. So this is what we're trying to do. We've done lots of research to figure out what kind of algae they need and things like that. So the last thing we do in here in the lab is really high-tech stuff. I'm not going to get into it in a lot of detail, but basically, remember I told you about that we have to have a fish in order to complete the mussel's life cycle, that larvae have to get on the fish. Well, we figured out a way around that. And what we do is we have these incubators. And inside these incubators, we have this red-looking liquid. It looks kind of like Kool-Aid. Now, it's not something like Kool-Aid, but it's got a lot of stuff in it. It's got even blood from a fish or from a rabbit, and we're able to put little tiny larvae into these little petri dishes, and then about 3 weeks later or less, we're able to have little juveniles crawling around. In fact, the juveniles I just showed you a minute ago were actually raised in a petri dish and not using a host fish. So it's really cool technology. We've been working on it here about 16 years. We have people from all over the world come and see us and try to learn how we do that. So now that we've done that, we talked a little bit about mussels in here. We're going to go in and actually see some juveniles that we're raising in the greenhouse. So follow me there. Remember, I did mention about we have a lot of endangered species, and here's an example of that. Here's all the different endangered mussels we have in the state of Kentucky. A lot of variety and kinds. Again, these are some of the rarest animals we have left on the planet. Like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Army Corps of Engineers, and other organizations, Kentucky Waterways Alliance. And we're able to get some funding to be able to build these buildings. Otherwise, it costs too much. So we're thankful for our sponsors and our people that help us with grants. So now we're in our greenhouse. This is our modern greenhouse that we built in about 11 years ago. And so we do a lot of stuff in here. The main thing is these little green trays. These little green trays have mussels in them. Each one of these trays can hold anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 mussels when they're very small, and then as they get bigger, we actually thin them out and actually move them to another hatchery we have in Moorhead, to the Minor Clark Fish Hatchery, where we let them grow out for a little longer. We also grow them out at other lakes and things like that, depending on where the species is from in the state. So we've really perfected these systems. These are all automated systems. We fill the feeders up in the mornings, and they automatically deliver the right amount of food, the right amount of water, the right kind of water during the day for 24 hours, and then each day we come in 7 days a week and make sure the feeders and water is all working correctly. So I want to show you a few mussels. So here's an example of what these trays look like. If you just look inside them, you can see some little tiny mussels in here. And I'm going to pull a little small one out. They're just big enough I can pick them up. So this one here is called the purple cat's paw. Remember I showed you a few minutes ago that one with the little teeth that would grab a hold of the fish? The interesting thing about this mussel is it's thought to be extinct about 20 years ago. And we're able to find some over the last several years, and we're able to raise these in captivity. We've released over 2,000 or 3,000 of these in the wild at about 10 locations from Ohio to Tennessee, West Virginia, and Kentucky. So it's pretty exciting that we're able to take these animals and do some conservation work. Now, as the mussels get a little bigger, like these Cumberland beans, and these are really pretty mussels. They live only in southeastern Kentucky, and this species is really on the decline over the last several years, but fortunately we've been able to raise several thousand of these mussels and rebuild some of the populations that are really low. So these guys are not even a year old, and we'll let them get a little bit bigger than this, and we'll put a little numbered tag on them and release them into the wild, hopefully this fall. We like to release in the fall. That's a good time for us to get out and to release them where they can still have some native food. So other things going on in here, we have more microscopes to be able to look at mussels. We have large algae tanks. I will show you this one tank that we've got. This was something that we needed some time ago, and what we were able to do is get some funding in from a sponsorship program called the Kentucky Wild. As a result of those donations, we were able to get this machine here. This is a really high-tech centrifuge, and what it allows us to do is when we raise our algae, we have to use nutrients like fertilizer. So we want to get the fertilizer out of the water and feed the mussels pure algae with no fertilizer. So this machine lets us do that. So we want to thank our Kentucky Wild sponsors that allowed us to get this product. Without that money, we wouldn't have been able to get that, because it is a few $1,000s for this item. So behind me are larger algae tanks, and we have all sizes and scales of these things. Right now we don't have them running, just because we just took them down just a few days ago. So just be aware that we're able to raise large amounts of algae in these large tanks to be able to produce more food for our mussels. Generally speaking, in May and June we have a lot of mussels here. Almost all our tanks are full, so we have a lot more food demands. It's early right now, early April, so we don't have a lot of demands right now. We don't have all our tanks full at this point. So one other thing I want to talk about is other species that we may be handling here. We handle host fish. We're going to show you some of those in a second. But we also have a large animal called the Hellbender, which is a native salamander. And we think it may be connected to freshwater mussels, maybe even a host. So I'm going to show you some really cool looking Hellbenders in another building. So here at the facility, we have several buildings that we use to raise different things, either fish. We have backup generators to be able to run the power in case the power goes off. We have to keep these tanks flowing at all times. So this building here was actually where I started the Center for Mollusk Conservation in 2002. 18 years ago, and we were able to use these old tanks that were built in the 1940s to be able to hold fish and even some mussels, and now we just use them as fish tanks. Some of them don't have anything in them right now, but we also have some that have some bass. Bass is a very good host for us, and you can see some of the bass that we have in here. A lot of them are being used right now, and they're hiding back in the corners. That's why you can't see them. So here in this tank, we have a very interesting animal that a lot of people don't know a lot about. It's called the Hellbender. It's the largest salamander we have in North America. It can get pretty long, well over 2 feet. It can live about 30 to 35 years, and it's a really cool animal. And so we're going to let you take a look at one of these Hellbenders. Now, I just sterilized my hands, so I don't want to get him any kind of thing. But you can see they are kind of slimy looking, and they like to crawl around between my hands. And a lot of people are afraid of them. They think they'll bite them. He's never bitten me. Watch him bite me today. But I'm going to let him back in the water so you can see him. And again, we're working with these animals. These are about 4 years old. We've had them here for almost 4 years, a little over 4, this less than 4 years. And we're trying to see if we can get them to reproduce in captivity. Now, we are working with partners at Purdue University to be able to raise actually Hellbenders to maybe augment some populations in the wild. So we are doing a lot of research with other partners, And that's part of our agency's strength is we work with a lot of people outside the agency, private organizations, and other things to be able to raise a lot of different kinds of animals and learn more about their life cycle and how important they are and how they relate. Hellbenders are really interesting because they only live in really good water quality. So their declines really should concern us, because if they're declining, then our water quality is declining. So, and the mussels follow along at the same rate. So we need to make sure we can protect our hellbenders, our mussels, and that'll protect our precious water that people love and cherish in this state. So let's go check out some fish hosts. This is something I'm sure most of you guys recently have been familiar with, is Sanitizer. We use a lot of Sanitizer. We want to make sure we keep our hands clean when we're going between buildings and buildings. And also we don't want to transmit any kind of disease between any of our organisms. So that's a pretty important thing here as well. Just leave it open. So back here we've got our fish building. So all these tanks in the back are going to have different kinds of fish in them. We have a lot of minnows, which are good hosts. We also have a lot of darters as well. And this building is kind of loud. We've got a lot of pumps running and things like this. So this building is one of our fish buildings, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what we're doing here. What we have here is we have some of the host fish that we keep. So we have to take care of them, we have to feed them, and we have to get them nice and healthy before we can actually use them as a host. So we have a lot of different species. A couple that we use pretty commonly are these log perch and these sculpin, which are in these two tanks. Log perch is a very common fish in Kentucky, but it's also one of the best hosts. So you can see they're used to me now. And another species of fish is called the sculpin. And these guys they're really odd looking fish, but they're pretty common in the state, in some parts of the state, maybe western part and middle. So how do we figure out how mussels and fish connect? We have to actually do the test. So we're going to show you some of the tanks that we use. So right now we've got some experiments going on. So we've got these fish that we've actually taken the larvae from the mussel, put them on the fish, and we're trying to see if the juveniles will fall off and work and become, so we know that this fish is a host. So we have, this is some more sculpin, banded sculpin, and these kind of look like little frogs under the water. But anyway, they're a good species of host, and so we're testing some species with these right now with one of the rare mussels, the cat's paw that I showed you earlier, the little purple one. So it's a host for that species, so it's pretty important for us to have that. So these tanks behind you, these are sophisticated recirculating systems we have to be able to test fish hosts. So what we'll do is we'll put larvae on a fish and put them in one tank, and then we'll put another species in another tank, and so on until we might have 50 different species and 100 tanks filled up with fish that have larvae on them. So we just wait a couple, 3 weeks and see which ones come off of each fish, and we'll know which host it is. So that's how we can do it. The last thing we do here is we make our own water. Since we deal with a lot of rare animals from all over the state, we have to make our own water. We do that with a large commercial reverse osmosis system like you normally might have under your kitchen sink at your house.